I do want to endorse the fact that the idea of having this conference and trying to focus attention on these issues, and actually in particular to provide the research basis for making policy rather than simply documenting the challenges, is actually very important. I mean, it's very important simply because, you know, we are about to go through a huge urbanization transition. I'm sure that this particular statistic must have been trotted out by someone during the course of these 2 days, but the one that we anchor most of our comments on, the urbanization challenge, is simply that we have about whatever 360, 370 million people in urban areas, what we call urban areas at the moment. We think that by 2030, that's another 20 years, this will go up to 600 million. So you've got something like 420 plus million, let's say, coming into the definition of into what are called urban areas. And the problem is, out of the existing population of maybe 370 or something, only about half are actually being given services that on our standards, and these are not global standards, they're actually very far from global standards. Our standards we would regard as reasonable services for urban areas. When I look at that, it's a little frightening, and the only thing I'm cheered by is the odd reference every now and then that, you know, cities in industrialized countries were also pretty horrible messes not that long ago. It cheers me up in the sense that when you look at what they've been able to do, you realize that if you do it properly, it can get done. Of course, the difference is that we don't have that much time. I mean, if you just look at Delhi, Delhi was a comfortable 500,000 people at the time of independence. It is now, I don't know, 16 million, and by any calculation by 2020, it will be 20 million. Now, probably about the size of London. I don't know what London is now, but you know. Now, if you think how long it took for London to get to this size, and you think of the transformation taking place in Delhi in much, much shorter time, then you get a sense that we just don't have time, but B, we have the big advantage of being a late comer. So therefore, the research aspect and kind of the learning aspect must be a very important part of being able to solve the problem. I mean, otherwise, it's really very difficult to imagine that we'll get somewhere. What's the kind of research that, from a policymaker's point of view, would be interesting? Now, I want to preface this by saying it's generally a bad idea to limit research to the notion of serving a meal to policymakers. That you know, I mean, ideally, one would just say most good research wasn't done that way. I can only be helpful by sharing with you what are the kinds of things that people who are in the world of policy are sort of interested in, or make them wake up. I mean, if somebody were to suddenly say, and the next speaker is going to speak on X, suddenly they wake up and say, oh, that must be interesting. Well, I'm just going to give you a list. I'm not defending the list. This just happens to be what, from my particular perspective, would sort of wake me up, if you like. And maybe it's interesting and maybe it's not, but this is it. One is clearly, I mean, how did the urban management evolve in present industrialized countries? This relates to what I said earlier, because, you know, we know that there were huge problems and then they got resolved. So some tales, that sort of thing is always of interest. What most people looking at the policy side would really want to know is what have we laid out as a feasible thing to do, and are we actually anywhere close to doing what we ourselves said we should be doing? Clearly, what are the financing mechanisms that will work? I mean, that maybe because I'm an economist, and that's sort of very fundamental, because it's very clear. If you look at it coming from the outside, the urban problem is being posed as having to provide a whole lot of infrastructure to a group of people who just don't have money. Now, the interesting thing is the cities are where the rich people are. So I always find it amazing that when I meet with, I mean, the rich people, the urban guys are the guys with more money, the rural ones are the ones who need help. But whenever you go into an urban oriented meeting, what you do not get is a focus on, look, empower us to raise money. Generally, the argument is, I know you've just been to a meeting on how much money has to be spent by the government in the rural areas. Well, you know, you've got a big second thing coming because even more has to be spent on urban areas. So, I mean, we need to be clear on the financing side. I mean, what is wrong with our financing? It has to be the case that the central government is always trying to leverage resources through its own money. And it should expect to leverage less in rural areas and much more in urban areas. So from the financing point of view, is it taxation? Is it user charges? Is it realization of land value? I mean, it has to be some of these things. And I think whatever research is done that answers those questions would be very, very crucial. Obviously, there's a whole lot of issues related to spatial planning, and I mean, there are fashions in this. Are you rigid about it? You make it flexible. Urban transport planning is, again, something that, to my mind, lends itself to a lot of research in the sense that we know what happened in the industrialized world. We know what's happening in developing countries. We even know what's happening in India, and is working better in some places than others. So anything that informs this whole range of urban governance based on better research would be extraordinarily important. Clearly, the issue of greenhouse emissions related to building and construction, that has to be very important. I've seen numbers which say catchy sort of phrases like, you know, 70% of the commercial buildings that will be up in India if we grow the way we think we will, by the year 2030, 70% of those buildings have yet to be built. I mean, if there's really a whole lot of choices that could actually make buildings more energy efficient, I mean, these are choices that we need to be taking now. And clearly, whether we can take them or not depends very much on governance issues, spatial planning issues, who's got the power to do it, et cetera, et cetera. And finally, the whole question of property rights. I don't think we can actually expect to see sensible development in cities, including development of housing and development for the urban poor, et cetera, without a very clear appreciation of what are the property rights on which this sort of stuff is going to be built. And quite interestingly, in government policy, I mean, there is no clarity on this whatsoever, in the sense that the usual approach is we must build houses for the poor, but we must do everything possible to prevent them from selling it. So I think this is just, there's lots of unanswered questions there. And other countries must have experienced exactly the same problem. So here again, developing countries are an obvious source of learning from our point of view. And to my mind, that's another issue. The answers are not obvious, but more importantly, the policy prescriptions in each of these areas, which are very often pushed, can very easily be negated by asserting some first principle about whatever it is that you want to do. And that is classically, I mean, therefore it's a live issue. I don't know if it's a low-hanging fruit or a high-hanging fruit, but it's something we have to do something about.